So welcome to the session. We're going to talk a little bit today about the Singapore Convention on Mediation and really talk a little bit about why we think there are some fundamental flaws in the application of the convention, and then make a suggestion about where we think we can go from here. And so I'm going to ask Anna, if you don't mind, if you would sort of do a self-introduction and let people know who you are.
I'm Anna Goncalves. I'm a mediator. I work also inside organizations as coach and conflict resolver. And I have had the chance to participate with Daniel in a task force on ODR for several years with some nice and competent academics of this world. And I'm also the president of Instituto de Certificação e Formação de Mediadores Lusófonos that brings standards to the Portuguese-speaking countries, because I'm Portuguese. So in the resume is that. Thank you.
Right. So he's Portuguese, working in Brazil, living in Kuala Lumpur.
Nice summary.
And so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Daniel Rainey. I've been involved in dispute resolution since the 1980s, really, and have had an interest in technology and communication for a very long time. And I'm currently involved in a number of projects having to do with identity and standard setting, etc. So, Anna, do you want to share your screen and start the slides?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I'm hoping everyone can see on the slides. You can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, so what we're going to do today is talk about mediation in light of the Singapore Convention. And I guess maybe we should start by talking about what the Singapore Convention is. On August 7th in Singapore, the United Nations UNCTAD rolled out the Singapore Convention on Mediation. Anna was there. I was invited but couldn't make it, so she spoke for both of us quite eloquently. And this is the reason that they created it is to try to find a way to encourage the use of mediation as a dispute resolution settlement mechanism for international, particularly commercial disputes. And Anna will talk a little bit more about that later on as we go through. And I want to back up and talk just for a moment about mediation in the international context. So Anna, if you would put the next slide up. So mediation today, I mean, where are we with mediation today? I heard the other day at a conference I was at an estimate that there are approximately 300 ways to approach the process of mediation across the world. That sounds like a very large number, but when I thought about it, I thought, well, you know, that's probably in the ballpark, because there are, you know, well over 100 countries and probably well over 3 or 4 different ways to approach mediation in any one of those countries. So when you begin to think about the number of people who are doing mediation and the number of ways that mediation is being done, it really is sort of let a thousand flowers bloom. And this is, as we will talk about in a little bit, this is good in the sense that it encourages innovation and encourages creativity, but in many ways it also encourages uncertainty. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. And so the next slide, Anna, if you would. It's this graphic, I think, is pretty illustrative, and the quote there from a couple of academics who have done some work in international mediation. There are no clear standards internationally. You see all of the different ways that you can get power around the world, and pretty much parallels the way that you would find mediation processes around the world. Pardon me. And so what? I mean, what does that have to do with the Singapore Convention and with mediation being used in international dispute resolution? I have a friend who's an arbitrator and mediator in the Middle East, and he has always told me that the preference for arbitration in the Middle East and in other parts of the world stems from two things. One is certainty about process, and the other is about enforceability. And he has even on occasion mediated settlements in the oil and gas industry and taken those mediated settlements and given them to an arbitrator who issues them as an arbitral decision so that there is enforceability under the New York Convention. And so when we talk about the Singapore Convention, the ultimate reason for creating it in the first place was to do more or less what we've done with the New York Convention, and that is to create an environment in which mediation becomes an acceptable and useful approach to conflict in the international commercial setting. You go to the next slide, Anna. Put up the next piece. There you go. So the mediation paradox. Those of you who are old enough and think back on the development of home video will appreciate this this metaphor. At one time, there were two competing approaches to home video. There was Betamax and there was VHS. And Betamax was, by most technical standards, better. It was higher quality. So there are a number of things about it that made it desirable. But VHS is the process or the format that caught on. And I guess the parallel that we would draw is you have arbitration, litigation, and you have mediation as an approach to international resolution. Mediation, in many ways, is a much better way of approaching international disputes. Resolution rates are high, but usage rates are low. And usage rates are low not because the quality of the product is bad, but because the perception of that product is driving use of the other product, in this case, arbitration. I have the next slide, please, Anna. You put the rest of it up. So why is this paradox? Why is use low but utility high? And I'd flip these a little bit. I think one of the largest ones is the lack of knowledge about what to expect from the mediator. You remember the field of blooms that we saw before. If I'm involved in a dispute and I want to resolve that dispute and I go to a judge, I know what to expect in the country. I can look at the rules, I can look at the civil procedures or the criminal procedures or whatever happens to be the case in a country and know what to expect. If I go to an arbitrator, there are standards by which the arbitrator operates. So I can know what's going to happen with the arbitrator when I go before the arbitrator. I know what I'm getting into. If I go to a mediator, it depends on which country I'm in, which style of mediation the mediator uses, what the standards are, and unwritten, probably informal standards are in place in the area where the mediator operates. So as the party, when I go to the third party of mediation, I'm not sure exactly what I'm going to get necessarily. The second thing is lack of enforcement. If I go into a court, obviously there is an enforcement mechanism that the court has. If I go to arbitration and I have a problem with the way the arbitration was done, under the New York Convention, there is the ability to go into any of the signatory countries and have those arbitration agreements either upheld or thrown out for cause. In mediation, you don't have that. And so the Singapore Convention was designed to address both of these issues. We go to the next slide, Anna. So there's a paradox within the Singapore Convention. So the article says in the Singapore Convention that you can set aside a mediated settlement if there was a serious breach by the mediator of standards applicable to the mediator or the mediation. without which breach the party wouldn't have entered into the agreement. Well, that's great, except that there are no standards that are enunciated against which the mediator can be held. So if the rest of the Singapore Convention says, well, all you have to do is go into court and a judge can use this standard to judge whether or not the mediated settlement meets the baseline standards. Well, there are no standards. And so the judge is probably going to apply the standards from his or her own country or his or her own understanding of mediation. And so by creating the Singapore Convention and saying we want to have the mediation conducted by standards that the judge can use as a way to set aside the mediation settlement, we haven't really moved very far along the path toward utility. I haven't done anything to address my certainty of process, and I haven't done anything to address the ability of a judge to apply a certain process in the judgment about whether or not the mediated settlement should stand. And so there's a very seductive sort of impulse to say, okay, well, the way we solve this, obviously, is that we create universal standards and a universal code of conduct for mediators. And my response to that is, good luck. In my lifetime, that won't happen. In Anna's lifetime, that won't happen. And unless you're really young, as in not born yet, it's not going to happen in your lifetime. That is a morass, a swamp that you can wade into. And we've gone through it in the United States, I know, and we've gone through it in other places. It's very, very, very difficult to say to all the mediators who are out there, this is the way you're going to do business, because they each legitimately approach mediation in different ways, all of which may be appropriate for a particular case that they're helping with. So we're not going to get universal uniform codes of conduct. You can call me a pessimist if you'd like, but it's just not going to happen. So next slide, please, Anna. If you look at, is this an illustration of what I mean? This is a chart that Anna put together that looks on the left-hand side at organizations that have talked about process and talked about standards. And then across the top, there are the sort of general categories in which this discussion has tended to organize itself. You can see that there are holes and that not every organization talks about the same thing. And I can guarantee you that if you look inside those blocks at the discussions about, let's say, conflict of interest or independence, neutrality, and impartiality, there will be different language used inside those blocks that different organizations have used to talk about that issue. Even though it may come under the same heading, there probably isn't complete agreement about what you mean by any of those terms. And so this just, to me, illustrates the difficulty of thinking about fixing our international mediation problem by creating universal standards. Frankly, I think it's not going to happen. So Anna, I'll back away from this now. If you don't mind picking it up and sort of walking through the rest of our presentation before we open it up for questions.
Thank you, Daniel. And so continuing this thinking, the question that we ask ourselves is, do we want mediation to continue to be a marginal activity due to all the things that Daniel just explained? Or do we want mediation to become a professional, open to change, so that it becomes mainstream? That has been our thinking. And we know that having in place competency or occupational standards and the code of ethics are two of the standard characteristics that are commonly associated with a profession, along with formal education, training programs, a governance structure, and a recognition program. So an ability to accredit other training programs as meeting the standards of the profession. So how do we answer these questions and how do we move forward? One option is, of course, to try and create now an uniform code of conduct. And personally, I believe that if such a thing was possible, it would have already been done by all these organizations. So we see another stage that we call, for lack of better words, a code of disclosure. And here I'm just, is this, and we see this stage here before the uniform code of conduct. And so here there is, here there is a comparison between a code of conduct and a code of disclosure. As you can see in the second column, the code of disclosure is about setting a simple expectation for parties and counsel, the one that the very first thing that the mediator will do when meeting them during the pre-mediation is to disclose a set of information always structured in the same way, wherever the country they are in. And it is a unified list of topics of disclosure about the mediator's practice. The conduct may vary underneath each topic, but the list will always be the same. And drafting such a code of disclosure should just be easier than a code of conduct, since it's about agreeing on the vocabulary, defining the core topics of disclosure. And so, as you can see, always it supports and guarantees party self-determination. And for us, party self-determination is today a universally accepted principle in the mediation field globally. So in order to ensure this self-determination of the parties, the mediation shall inform the parties what to expect, regardless geography or the legal context where he is doing the mediation. There are other benefits for this approach. And I'm not going to spend time on this slide, since the only difference between this, as you can see, is that a code of disclosure does not protect parties from inappropriate behavior. This will still be the role of a code of conduct. But what it brings is consistency in how the code of conduct are written. And so if we say it differently, it will create a platform motivating mediation organizations to follow the same script when rewriting their code of conducts. It will be a step towards a unified code of conduct then. And so here is what is happening today following the Singapore Convention. A group of academics already formed a working group on a unified code of disclosure. Daniel and myself, we start this group. Other stakeholders of mediation will join the group, so we have a representation of all the involved. Once we define the working group, we'll also discuss how to link this to the Singapore Convention, and we already asked the support of UNCITRAL on this initiative. I believe that the existence of the Singapore Convention has helped major mediation organizations who were consulted to get to working together. And as I said previously, elaborating such a code should be easier than trying to uniformize all the codes of conduct around the world. So in a nutshell, now I'm going to put uniform code of disclosure will ensure an informed consent and autonomy of the parties, will allow anyone who questions the actions of the mediator under the Singapore Convention to have a baseline of what the parties agree to as the mediation process. And this is something that today we don't have in most part of the mediations worldwide. It eliminates the need to unify all these culturally different approach to mediation that, as Daniel said, it's not possible, it's not desirable, it's not how mediation works today in the world. And it's about only coding the list of topics of disclosure, not the content. And the mediator will just have to tell everyone on the front end what approach he or she is taking, so that the agreement on the process a priori. And then he can adjust that and reconfirm that during the process. But this is documented and the topics will be the same. Also, it will give a judge a baseline of expected behavior against which she or he could make determinations regarding breaches of process. This is what we agree we are going to do. That's what all this is about. And also, in our understanding, reconciling the topics of disclosure is less controversial than reconciling the conducts. And so, in conclusion, we have today this way to go until then. And so what we want today is that we have the Unified Code of Disclosure. Of course, we will suggest some scientific studies that will see how the customers are answering to this Code of Disclosure and how to ensure that it allows customers to understand the process and allows the Singapore Convention to be correctly used. And all of this, what we expect is that not have a Betamax of the mediation, but have a VHS of the mediation. And so this is what we prepare today. Daniel?
Yeah, so we will take questions if you have any. You can do them either by the chat version, or you can unmute your microphone and ask them. So if anyone has any questions, please let us know. One of the things that I would just say while you may be thinking about it is that there are a number of projects underway to apply mediation internationally to business and business to consumer disputes. There are a couple of problems with them. One is it's very difficult to get agreement. I've mentioned before, in fact, we talked about it a little while ago in another session, that the UNCITRAL met for 6 years trying to come up with standards for how to do cross-border international mediated settlements for business to consumer disputes, and wound up having no good ideas beyond some observations. And that APEC has recently issued a set of guidelines for business to business dispute resolution internationally with mediation. But those are voluntary and would apply only to APEC countries that voluntarily accepted them. So there isn't on the horizon, as far as I can tell, any serious effort to standardize mediation in any sort of meaningful way. And so if we don't think about this as a way to regularize the disclosure of process on the front end to establish the ability of the parties to engage in self-determination and to accept a process voluntarily, then I'm not exactly sure how we go forward. And I don't have a really warm and fuzzy feeling about the outcome of the Singapore Convention.
Dan, this is Larry. Yeah, go ahead, Anna. Sorry.
Hi, Larry.
Hi, Anna. Go ahead.
Can you all still hear me? I just got a message on my machine saying that I was signed out because someone signed in on another machine. I think Colin may be trying to join us. I'm not sure. But can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fine. Thanks. Go ahead, Larry.
I was just going to say I attended the APEC meeting last year in Osaka. And from my perspective, there really isn't a great deal of standard setting taking place. It is following the unit trial efforts and other efforts that have already been sort of standardizing policy and practices. I would encourage the work that you all are doing as a better approach and offer to assist in any way if there's any value to that. Because I think what you're doing has an opportunity to build credibility as it goes, and again, becomes more of a bottom-up than a top-down approach to the way in which things could best serve the community of interest in mediation, and there's a great deal of work to do.
Larry, I'll send you a link to the doodle poll that we're trying to set up the meeting, because I'd love to have you involved.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Did someone else have a question? I thought someone unmuted there for a moment.
I'm just...
It was Claire. I unmuted accidentally. Sorry.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Okay. So anybody have any questions at all? I think we were pretty straightforward about the presentation of what we're trying to do. So,
We have one chat.
Lynn Johnson has just done a question on the text.
Does Lynn just sent us a chat? Does not having the parties agree to a set of standards address some of this?
Well, the answer would be yes, if that's exactly where we're trying to go. If you have a standard of disclosure, what we mean by that is that if I'm the third party, if I'm the mediator, there are certain things that I should be telling you on the front end about my process. I am a facilitative mediator. We will meet in this way. I will conduct myself in this way. So I'm going to tell you what my process is going to be. That may be very, very different from what Anna would do or what Larry would do or what Colin would do, but I'm going to explain to you in a structured way what I'm going to do. And when you say, yes, I agree to that, you've disclosed your process, I agree to that process, I'm telling you I am entering into your process voluntarily, then those things that I've told you in my disclosure become the standards that a judge can use to see whether or not I have violated the process. If I don't do that, if I simply say, let's go into mediation, and you walk in the door as parties and I'm the mediator, I may be doing transformative mediation, I may be doing facilitative, I may be doing any other. And so if I then have a problem with that as a party, and I go to a judge and say, hey, this guy was just really off the reservation. He was just really off the wall. It was a horrible process. It was a gross violation of standards. Well, what standards am I grossly violating? If you haven't been given disclosure and you don't know what the process is going to be, and the judge has no baseline on which to make a decision about whether or not I violated that, it seems to me we're still at sea. So your question, I would say yes. If I can establish for you the way I'm going to do my business as a mediator, and that I don't do that, then those are standards you can use to argue that we should set aside this agreement. If I haven't done that, it becomes very, very murky in terms of what is and what is not a gross violation of standards. Does that make sense? I mean, I'm sort of rambling a little bit here, but I hope that makes sense as a response to your question.
And also, Daniel, you can say the topics that we are going to choose on the different ways of the world or places of the world can be different. And so having a list of, having an exhaustive list of topics, then you can pick the ones that make sense to that part of the world and to that mediation. I'm just going to see. Does not having the parties agree to a set of standards attention? Yes, I assume that was the case now. Okay, thank you, Lynn.
Yeah, thank you, Lynn. Any other questions or comments? I'm kind of curious about, Larry's given us an endorsement, which means a lot to me. But what do some of the rest of you think about whether or not we're crazy or whether or not this is worth doing?
We did not define what silence means, Daniel, before. We should have decided if you get silence, it means something. If you, any idea? Any sharing?
Well, I see absolutely worth doing. Thank you very much. I like that. Yeah, I don't want to hold you all here, longer.
Thank you.
We're willing to talk about this as long as you want to talk about it. But when we're done, we're done. Just to underscore what Anna said at the end, what we're doing is convening an initial group to talk about how to structure this and how to go forward. If we're successful in what we're doing, this is not going to go away. You're going to hear about it probably a lot. And hopefully it will be done in conjunction with some of the international organizations that you're very familiar with. And the fact that not everybody in the world got invited to the initial discussion of brainstorming how we organize this doesn't mean that we're not interested in a ground up, bottom up approach so that we get as much input as we can possibly get as we go forward. The only way in my mind, the only way any kind of standard setting is going to work in the mediation field is if we very, very clearly define the narrow range in which we're trying to set those standards and get as many voices involved as possible. I think Anna made an offhand comment that I think I want to go back and highlight that's very important to me. And that is that if you look at the way mediation is done around the world, there aren't that many things that are universal. But the idea of party self-disclosure is about as close as we come. And that's really what generated this idea between the two of us is, you know, is there something out there that pretty much everybody would say, yeah, that's basic. And to us, party self-determination was that thing that we thought was as close to universal as we could find. We may find that there are others as we begin the conversation, but that's where we started.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
Anna, you have any final words?
No, I think that about this topic, everything is said. We are open to comments, suggestions, ideas, because really the purpose is to start brainstorming what would be those topics, because we don't want to have a list that is closed. We want to think about what can be done in Asia, what can be done in America, what can be done in Latin America, and in other regions of the world. So this can be global, because the Singapore Convention is for international matters. So that's the starting point of this idea, and what makes us believe that this work needs to be started. Yeah.
One more time for any questions or comments. Going once, going twice. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, everyone. I appreciate that. And just as the very last thing, there are a couple of things coming up that I are involved in. There's the ODR practitioner certification program that we're running that this time is running basically in Brazil and Switzerland and Portugal and the US, is coming up again in March of next year. That's on the screen. Contact either one of us for information about that. And then coming up on the 29th is a session with Paul Embley talking about courts, and this will be centered in Brazil, but is available basically everywhere. So if you're interested in that, call us and we can put you in touch with that as well. So once again, thanks everybody. I'm going to stop the recording now, and we will call an end to the session.